All right, hello everybody. This is Antonio Wolf, continuing the essay on natural law. We have done the section on empiricism, the section on rationalism, and now we are going on to natural law itself. I don't know very much about natural law, so this should be quite a lot of new stuff for me. So, okay. The absolute concept, which is the principle of opposition and also opposition itself, shows itself, because it is fixed, in separation, so that as pure unity opposed to itself, it is multiplicity, so that it remains absolute concept both under the form of pure unity and under that of pure multiplicity. So that in the form of multiplicity, it is not a variety of different specific concepts, but is subsumed under multiplicity just as under unity. The concept subsumes itself in many specific concepts and is not a many but a one. The absolute concept, itself a multiplicity, is a number of subjects to which it is opposed, in the form of pure unity as absolute quantity, against this its own qualitative posited existence. Thus are posited one and inner oneness of the opposites, which is the essence of both, is the absolute concept. And two, a severance of this concept under the form of unity, in which form it is right and duty, and under the form of multiplicity, in which it is a thinking and willing subject. All right. Recap on the concept, but the concept assumes itself in many specific concepts and is not a many but a one. Why know that? The absolute concept, itself a multiplicity, is a number of subjects to which it is opposed, in the form of pure unity as absolute quantity, against its own qualitative posited existence. I assume that the quantitative aspect is that it is one and the qualities are many. Thus are posited one and inner oneness of the opposites, which is the essence of both, is the absolute concept. All right, the unity. And two, a severance of this concept under the form of unity, in which form it is right and duty, and under the form of multiplicity, in which it is a thinking and willing subject. Okay. Same stuff we went over last time about the formal universal, the abstract universal versus the many, or the content, the empirical content. The former aspect, under the essence of right and duty, and the essence of the thinking and willing subject are one and the same, is, as is in general the higher abstraction of infinity, the great element in the philosophy of Kant and Fichte. But that philosophy has not remained true to this oneness. By recognizing this oneness as the essence and the absolute, it posits a separation into the one and the many just as absolutely, and places one beside the other as equals. As a result, the oneness is not the positive absolute, which has constituted the essence of both, in which they would be, and in which they would be one, but the negative absolute or the absolute concept. And further, this necessary oneness becomes formal. The two opposed specifications, posited absolutely, thereby in their subsistence fall under ideality, which is to this extent the pure possibility of both. It is possible for right and duty to have reality independently as something particular apart from individuals, and for individuals to have a reality apart from right and duty. But it is also possible that both are linked together. And it is absolutely necessary for both possibilities to be separate and to be kept distinct, so that each may ground a special science, one dealing with the unity of the pure concepts and the subjects, or the morality of actions, the other with their non-unity, or legality. In such a way that, if in the division of the ethical sphere into morality and legality, the two become mere possibilities, they both are equally positive for that very reason. And here Hegel means positive in the sense of posited, which outside of that which is posited in his philosophy is abstraction. Let me reread that. And it is absolutely necessary for both possibilities to be separate and to be kept distinct, so that each may ground a special science, one dealing with the unity of the pure concept and the subjects, or the morality of actions, the other with their non-unity or legality. So under morality, we have the assumption that the concepts and subjects go together, and under legality, we have that they are distinct, and that makes sense, because then that's what makes sense of law as being the objective moral order, even when subjects fail to be moral. Someone asked a question, so would we say that abstract is positivity? Just trying to clarify. Yeah. Something just put forth in abstraction is positive.
But there's when you posit something, it belongs to the thing that posited it. So there's also this linking between what is posited and what is doing the positing. So I don't know if that's helpful, but there's that
now,
link.
This is before he made that distinction. Like positive in early Hegel is always pure abstraction, something put forth but without reason.
Yeah, maybe actually. Okay.
Of course, the one is negative. The negative. Of course, the one is negative for the other, but so they both are. It is not the one. It is not that one is the absolutely positive, the other the absolutely negative. Each is both in relation to one another, and since at first both are only relatively positive, neither legality nor morality is absolutely positive or genuinely ethical. And since each of them is just as positive as the other, both are absolutely necessary. And the possibility that the pure concept and the subject of right and duty are not. And the possibility that the pure concept and the subject of right and duty are not one must be posited unalterably and without qualification. Right, when he says and since each of them is just as positive as the other, both are absolutely necessary. So, okay, maybe I'm mistaken about how he's using positive here. I mean, it aligns, but maybe he's being a bit more positive about it. Hence, the fundamental concepts of the system of legality reveal themselves directly as follows. There is a conditioning of pure self-consciousness. This pure self-consciousness, the ego, is the true essence and the absolute, but nevertheless it is conditioned, and its condition is that it advances to a real consciousness. These two forms of consciousness remain downright opposed to one another in the relation of being mutually conditioned. That the pure self-consciousness, pure unity, or the empty ethical law, the universal freedom of everyone, is opposed to real consciousness, that is, to the subject, to the rational being, to individual freedom. Fichte expresses the matter in a more popular way as the presupposition that faith and constancy are lost. On this presupposition, a system is built whereby both the concept and the individual subject of ethical life are supposed to be united despite their separation. Though the unity is on this account only formal and external, and this relation between them is called compulsion. In this way, the external character of oneness is utterly fixed and posited as something absolute and inherently necessary, and thereby the inner life, the rebuilding of the lost constancy and faith, the unity of universal and individual freedom, and ethical life itself are made impossible. Here we confine ourselves to Fichte's argument. It is the most consistent, the least formal, and it really is an attempt at a consistent system which would have no need of the religion and ethics that are foreign to it. In a system of such an externality, as in In any argument that proceeds from conditioned to conditioned, nothing unconditioned can be exhibited, or if it is posited, it is only formal indifference, which has the conditioned difference outside itself, essence without form, power without wisdom, quantity without inner quality or infinity, rest without movement. The supreme task in an arrangement working with a mechanical necessity, the task of compelling the activity of every individual to accord with the general will, since this general will must necessarily be real in the subjects, who are its organs and administrators, is a task which presupposes an opposition between the individual will and the general will. Oneness with the general will thus cannot be understood and posited as inner absolute majesty, but only as something which is to be brought about by an external relation or by compulsion. But in reality, in the process of compulsion and supervision, which is to be set going, there can be neither an infinite series nor a leap from the real to the ideal. There must be a supreme positive point from which compulsion, according to the concept of freedom, of universal freedom, starts. But this point, like all others, must be compelled to compel according to the concept of universal freedom, a point which, in this universal system of compulsion, would not be compelled, would depart from the principle of the system and be transcendent. So, this is looking like Plato's problem of the philosopher kings who rule by the compulsion of the good, but no one is there to compel them to rule by the good. Now the question is how this supreme will by compulsion and supervision is also to become correspondent with the concept of the general will, and how the system is accordingly to remain wholly immanent and transcendental. This could happen only if the power of the whole were so distributed between the two sides that stand over against one another, that the governed are compelled by the government and vice versa. If the power, and with it the possible compulsion by either side, is given unequal strength, then the result is that, in proportion as one part has more power than the other, or as each has an excess over the other, only one part and not its opposite is under compulsion, which ought not to happen. But strictly speaking, only excess power is truly powerful, because in order for something to set limits to something else, it must be equal to it. The weaker is no limit for the stronger. Both must thus compel and be compelled reciprocally with equal power. But if in this way action and reaction, position and opposition are equally strong, the power on both sides is reduced to equilibrium, and all activity, action, and expression of the will is thereby cancelled. The reduction of the opposites may be thought either positively or negatively. Action and reaction may be posited as existing and working, or they may be posited negatively. An equilibrium results from the fact that there is neither action nor reaction. Nor is it a true solution to propose a remedy for this death by extending the immediate confrontation of the opposites into a circle of effects, and so apparently cancelling the midpoint of their contact, where the reduction of the opposites appears, by the deceptive expedient of leaving this midpoint empty. Okay, let me read that. The reduction of the opposites may be thought either positively or negatively. Action and reaction may be posited as existing and working, or they may be posited negatively. An equilibrium results from the fact that there is neither action nor reaction. Nor is it a true solution to propose a remedy for this death by extending the immediate confrontation of the opposites into a circle of effects, and so apparently cancelling the midpoint of their contact, where the reduction of the opposites appears, by the deceptive expedient of leaving this midpoint empty. So in the first case of action and reaction, that's the government compels the people compel the government in turn. The other one is that they mutually compel each other and cancel each other out immediately, and so they are equilibrium, and therefore they accomplish nothing. But nor is it a true solution to propose a remedy for this death by extending the immediate confrontation of the opposites into a circle of effects, and so apparently cancelling the midpoint of their contact by the deceptive expedient of leaving this midpoint empty. So I'm not sure what he means by circle of effects here. I mean, clearly if this is to try to mediate such that they don't directly contact, and therefore, the clash doesn't immediately happen, that would make sense. I mean, that would be a useless solution, right? That if you really have an opposition of power, it doesn't matter how many mediations you put between it, that opposition nonetheless exists, and there really is no neutral party within that resolves anything. Against the hierarchy of compulsion descending from the supreme power through all its branches down to every individual, a similar pyramid is in turn supposed to rise upwards from the individuals to the supreme pinnacle of counterpressure meeting the descending pressure. Thus the whole is supposed to bend in a circle wherein the immediacy of contact would vanish, the forces insofar as they are massed together would be held apart, and intervening members would produce the artificial difference. Thus no member reacts directly on that by which it is moved, producing equilibrium, but always on some other member, so that the first moves the last and the last the first. Okay, well, this gives details to what I was wondering. Let me read that. Against the hierarchy of compulsion descending from the supreme power through all its branches down to every individual, a similar pyramid is in turn supposed to rise upwards from the individuals to the supreme pinnacle of counterpressure meeting the descending pressure. Thus the whole is supposed to bend in a circle wherein the immediacy of contact would vanish. The forces insofar as they are massed together would be held apart, intervening members would produce that artificial difference. Thus no member reacts directly on that by which it is moved, but always on some other member, so that the first moves the last and the last moves the first. Oh, okay. So this would be like... I mean, he gives the visual here. It'd be like a circle in which there's one side of pressure coming from one direction and one side of pressure going to the other direction. You have the top of a circle, the state, the bottom of the circle, the people. In the state pushes down on the people, and the people do not then counter-push in the same opposite direction, but are pushed by that pressure circularly along the circumference of the circle back around onto the state, and therefore there is no immediate counter push. It's always mediated. So there's not an immediate clash head on, and this is not a solution. Yeah, welcome, Josh. So that makes sense. That's kind of weird that, we'll see what he says why this isn't the model that works, because this is, on a very simplistic face of it, precisely what I would expect the model to look like for Hegel. We'll see. But such a perpetuum mobile, whose parts are all supposed to follow one another around the circle, will, instead of moving, settle at once into complete equilibrium and become a complete perpetuum quietum. For pressure and counterpressure, coercing and being coerced, are entirely equal, and they stand directly against each other and effect the same reduction of forces as in the first conception. Okay, so part of the problem with that is that it erases a genuine opposition. Right? Like, everybody just gets stuck in the machine. Because insofar the state pushes, as hard the state pushes, just as hard do the people push, and therefore but they push in the same general flow. So there is really no change. It's a quiet perpetuity. Well, it's a movement, a perpetual movement, and then it's just a movement which in moving goes nowhere, is what I'm understanding. Pure quantity cannot be deceived by such mediation, whereby no difference whatever, no true infinity or form is introduced into it. Okay, that certainly goes over what I was thinking. That this erases the possibility of genuine differences. Okay, pure quantity cannot be deceived by such mediation, whereby no difference whatever, no true infinity or form is introduced into it. It remains as before, a completely undivided, pure, formless might. On this line, might cannot be compelled to fit the concept of universal freedom, for there is no power outside it, and no division can be set up within it. So this is really an abstract universal. There is no difference within it, insofar as the people in the government forms one circular system exactly in the same direction. It's really one force, one power, and it makes no difference the state or the people, and it has nothing outside it but nothing within it. So it's just an abstract immediacy. It's really nothing except that pure power. The next thing, therefore, is a resort to a purely formal distinction. Actual power is, of course, posited as one, united in the government, but it is opposed by possible power, and this possibility, it is claimed, can as such compel that actuality. This second powerless existence of the general will is supposedly entitled to judge whether the power has forsaken the first kind of will to which it is tied, or whether the power no longer fits the concept of universal freedom. The general will is supposed to supervise the supreme power generally, and when a private will replaces the general will in it, to wrest that power from this private will. This is supposed to happen by way of a public declaration with absolute authority of the total nullity of every action of the supreme power of the state from this moment onwards. It would be insurrection for this power to separate itself by its own independent decision. But this must not happen, since this pure power consists entirely of private wills, which accordingly are incapable of constituting themselves as a general will. But it is the second general will which declares this mass of private wills to be united as a community, or the pure power to be united with the idea of the general will, because the latter no longer exists in the former holders of power. All right, let me read that. Starting from the top of the paragraph. The next thing, therefore, is a resort to a purely formal distinction. Actual power is, of course, posited as one, united in the government. But it is opposed by possible power, and this possibility, it is claimed, can as such compel the actuality. This second powerless existence of the general will is supposedly entitled to judge whether the power has forsaken the first kind of will to which it is tied, or whether the power no longer fits the concept of universal freedom. All right, clear so far. The general will is supposed to supervise the supreme power generally, and when a private will replaces the general will in it, to wrest that power from this private will. This is supposed to happen by way of a public declaration with absolute authority of the total nullity of every action of the supreme power of the state from this moment onwards. It would be insurrection for this power to separate itself by its own independent decision. But this must not happen, since this pure power... Hold on. Okay, Let me read that. This is supposed to happen by way of a public declaration with absolute authority of the total nullity of reaction of the supreme power of the state from this moment onwards. It would be insurrection for this power to separate itself by its own independent decision. But this must not happen, since this pure power consists entirely of private wills, which accordingly are incapable of constituting themselves as a general will. But it is the second general will which declares this mass of private wills to be united as a community, or the pure power to be united with the idea of the general will, because the latter no longer exists in the former holders of power. Alright, I'm not quite clear on it would be insurrection for this power to separate itself by its own independent decision. Alright, this is supposed to happen by restarting this. This is supposed to happen by way of a public declaration with absolute authority of the total nullity of every action of supreme power of the state from this moment onwards. So, there's the general will as the possibility of power, and there's the state as the actual power, the government. The general will, the people, so to say, judge whether the state is in accord with universal freedom or the general will. The general will is supposed to supervise the supreme power generally, and when a private will replaces the general will in it, to wrest that power from this private will. This is supposed to happen by way of a public declaration with absolute authority of the total nullity of every action of the supreme power of the state from this movement onwards. It would be insurrection for this power to separate itself by its own independent decision. So I'm not sure which power he's referring to there. If he's referring to the government or the general will.
I think it's referring to the general will.
But how could the general will be an insurrection when the general will is the one that has the power and authority to judge whether the state is or is not in accord with the principles of freedom, and therefore the justification of power?
I mean, it isn't just like... I think it's about maintaining that circle, right? And the point is, like, when the general will isn't acting within that circle, or the state isn't acting within that circle, it's insurrection.
So you think it's insurrection in the sense that the people would go up against the government and say, now we are a new government opposing your government?
Yeah, I think that's what it means, but I might be misinterpreting.
No, that would make sense. And so it wouldn't be insurrection in which they say, we're still the government, we are the same government, and the people who are in power don't have the legitimacy of the general will anymore. So it's not a new government against an old government or another government. It's the same government standing within a process of itself, right? Yeah, that would make sense. But this must not happen, since this pure power consists entirely of private wills, which accordingly are incapable of constituting themselves as a general will. But it is the second general will which declares this mass of private wills to be united as a community, or the pure power to be united with the idea of the general will, because the latter no longer exists in the former holders of power. Okay, but this must, so it would be insurrection for this power to separate itself from its own independent decision. But this must not happen, since this pure power consists entirely of private wills, which accordingly are incapable of constituting themselves as a general will. So there should not be an insurrection But any particular individuals is a private will, and even if the people those individuals come together, they don't. Just coming together does not form a general will.
Yes, exactly. So I guess it's not really the general will that would constitute an insurrection. It'd be more like...
It'd be like what happened in January
Yeah,
6th?
yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Like, if they succeeded, that would be an insurrection in this sense. Because that clearly isn't the general will of America.
Yeah. But it is the second general will which declares this mass of private wills to be united as a community, or the pure power to be united with the idea of the general will, because the latter no longer exists in the former holders of power. Alright, makes sense. Well, sorry, Danny. We're all not political geniuses here, alright? Yeah, it's not that complicated. Whatever institution is posited to wring something from the supreme power, this institution must be invested with, not the mere possibility of, but power itself. But since this power is held by the other representatives of the general will, it can hinder any such institution and nullify whatever functions are given to the efferate, supervision, public declaration of the interdict, and whatever other formalities are hatched. Is that footnote?
Oh, also, just to be clear, when I came in, I heard stuff about Fichte, but this all sounds like Rousseau to me. Is he discussing more so Rousseau or Fichte?
He's discussing Fichte, and he says that he's going to focus on Fichte specifically. But Fichte definitely took a lot of Rousseau's ideas.
Yeah, I mean, all of this about the general will is basically the same way Rousseau puts it, which is what I'm familiar with. I don't know what Fichte says on it.
More complicated, that's for sure.
Yeah, probably.
All right. And all this is done with as much right as those in whose hands the operation of this institution would have been placed. For these iphors are also just as much private wills as the others are, and whether their private will has sundered itself from the general will is a matter that the government can judge just as easily as the efferate can judge the government. Can you look up what the hell that means?
Efferate?
Efferate, yeah. Just as easily as the effort can judge the government. The government, moreover, can enforce its judgment. It is known that on the occasion of a government's recent dissolution of a rival and paralyzing legislative force, a man who was himself involved in it, responding to the suggestion that the establishment of a supervisory commission, similar to Fichte's effort, would have prevented such an atrocity, judged correctly that a council with a similar supervisory powers and the will to oppose the government would have been treated just as violently.
Okay, apparently it's the, an effer is one of 5 elected magistrates exercising as supervisory power over the kings of Sparta. I guess it's like a council over the king's power. Something along that line.
Yeah, Danny posted it, ephor, Greek ephoros, title of the highest Spartan magistrates, 5 in number, who with the kings formed the main executive wing of the state in antiquity time periods, were recorded by the names of the ephors on a list that dated back. Okay. So a kind of philosopher king, seems like.
It's like a philosopher king council, probably, is what he had in mind. Like, not one philosopher king. Well, maybe one, but a group of them making the decisions.
Yeah, okay, let me reread that. Okay, whatever institution is posited to wring something from the supreme power, this institution must be invested with, not the mere possibility of, but the power itself. Makes sense. But since this power is held by the other representatives of the general will, It can hinder any such institution and nullify whatever functions are given to the effort. Alright, so an institution that's going to take power away from the given government that has failed must have power itself. This power is held by other representatives of the general will. It can hinder any such institution and nullify whatever functions are given to the effort. Okay, so these people who would wrest power from a corrupt leader or the corrupt state would be the efforts, but since they don't have absolute power, they share power distributively with the rest of the state or the representatives of the general will. Those other people can then get in their way of taking that power away from those who are corrupt. Supervision, public declaration of the interdict, and whatever other formalities are hatched. Right, it's just like how impeachment in the U.S. is almost impossible, just because even if a president were justified to be impeached, and they should be impeached, and should be, should pay some kind of penalty for supposed crimes. Nonetheless, this is a inter-party process, and the power is shared between parties. And so, if the other party doesn't want to, or if other members in your own party don't want to, your power, you have the formal power, you don't have the actual power. And all this is done with as much right as those in whose hands the operation of this institution would have been placed. For these efforts are also just as much private wills as the others are, and whether their private will has sundered itself from the general will is a matter that the government can judge just as easily as the effort can judge the government. The government, moreover, can enforce its judgment. It is known that on the occasion of a government's recent dissolution of a rival and paralyzing legislative force, a man who was himself involved in it, responding to the suggestion that the establishment of a supervisory commission similar to Fichte's effort would have prevented such an atrocity, judged correctly that a council with similar supervisory powers and the will to oppose the government would have been treated just as violently. Wonder who he's talking about. Sounds like the French Revolution, but there's a lot of states that were having crazy things happen at the time.
Wait, sorry, what's he saying?
Yeah, he's giving the example. There was a government in which, there was an institution that was trying to wrest power from some perceived corruption in the state, but then they were, he says, it is known that the occasion of a government recent dissolution of a rival and paralyzing legislative force, a man who was himself involved in it, responding to the suggestion that the establishment of a supervisory commission similar to Fichte's effort would have prevented such an atrocity, judged correctly that a council with similar supervisory powers and the will to oppose the government would have been treated just as violently. So it was it
probably has to do with the French Revolution. I mean, I don't know when exactly this was written. Maybe he's talking about...
It's 1803.
He could be talking about Napoleon. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like it's a common thing, or at least it was a common thing back then, right? How many times did kings dissolve parliaments? That would be an opposing force. And then if people said, "Oh, if we only had this advisory council with formal," it's like, well, actually, in the case of the U.S., it's like the Supreme Court.
That's kind of what happened in the start of the French Revolution, in which shit was going down. The king decided, okay, I'm gonna call back the three estates. They're gonna vote on things again, and it didn't fix shit. Maybe he's referring to that. I don't know.
Probably not. But the point stands. It's like the Supreme Court in the U.S., where the Supreme Court has a formal power, and yet actually has no power. And so even if the Supreme Court indicted the government or any branch of the government or the executive of doing something unconstitutional, it can't do jack shit. So even if you had these F-wars, what the hell would they do? Unless they are invested with real power, in which case they are the government already. Then what does the supervision matter? You can have all these layers of councils, it doesn't mean jack shit. It's like the United Nations. They can oversee all these other things and report on them. Who cares? They have no power. Lastly, however, if the holders of supreme power decided of their own volition to permit this second representative of the general will to summon the community to choose between them and the supervisors, what would be set in motion with such a mob who would also supervise all private matters, whose life is even less public, and who is simply not educated to be conscious of the general will, or to act in the spirit of the whole, but exactly the opposite. I'm assuming here he's talking about what happened with the French Revolution. It's, by the way, it's why there is an interest of never allowing a constitutional convention to be called in the United States, because even if it was just for to ratify an amendment, if you call a constitutional convention, everything's on the table, including the Constitution itself. And as to who goes and what gets decided is entirely dependent on completely arbitrary and informal considerations, which cannot and are not stipulated in the Constitution itself. And such a thing were convened, there would be some measure of chaos. I don't think it would be exactly violent chaos immediately, but you're talking about the struggle of the foundation of the new structures of the state, or at the very least the restructuring of power, and who has power and why. What this has shown is that the ethical order posited according to relations alone, or externality, and coercion understood as a totality, is self-canceling. This proves indeed that coercion is nothing real, nothing in itself. This will become even clearer if we show it in relation to coercion itself according to its concept and according to the specific character with which the relation of this tie. This will become even clearer if we show it in relation to coercion itself according to its concept and according to the specific character which the relation of this tie has. For in part, dialectic has to prove that relation is nothing whatever in itself, and in part, this has already been briefly shown above. Of the concepts in general which go together with coercion and express precisely this relation, it has been shown in part above that they are abstractions without substance, entia rationis, or creatures of imagination without reality. First, there appears the empty abstraction of the concept of the universal freedom of all, separate from the freedom of individuals. And next, on the other side, this very freedom of the individual, comparably isolated. Each posited by itself is an abstraction without reality, but both as absolutely identical and then posited merely in this first fundamental identity are something quite different from those concepts which have their significance only in non-identity. Next, natural or original freedom is to be limited by the concept of universal freedom. But that original freedom, which may be posited as limitable, is for this very reason a nothing absolute. And further, it is in an inherent contradiction to construct an idea of the freedom of the individual through the externality of coercion is with absolute necessity adequate to the concept of universal freedom. This is simply to imagine that the individual, by means of something not absolute, is yet absolutely equal to the universal. In the concept of coercion itself, something external to freedom is immediately posited, but a freedom for which something is genuinely external and alien is no freedom. Its essence in its formal definition is just that nothing is absolutely external. So the essence of and formal definition of freedom is that nothing is absolutely external. So coercion doesn't make sense to be in a theory of a free state. We must completely reject that view of freedom whereby freedom is supposedly a choice between opposed entities, so that if positive A and negative A are given, freedom consists in selecting either positive A or negative A and is absolutely bound to this either or. Anything like this possibility of choice is wholly an empirical freedom, which is one with empirical common necessity and wholly inseparable from it. Freedom is rather the negation or ideality of the opposites as much of positive A as of negative A. The abstraction of the possibility that either of them is. Something external would be for freedom only if freedom were characterized as only positive A or only negative A. But freedom is just the opposite. Nothing is external for it, so that for it no coercion is possible. Everything specific is in its essence either positive A or negative A, and negative A is indissolubly linked to positive A, just as positive A is to negative A. As soon as the individual has put himself in the specific position of positive A, he is equally tied to negative A, and negative A is something external for him, not in his power. On the other hand, because of the absolute tie between positive A and negative A, he would be brought directly under the alien power of negative A because of the specific position of positive A. And a freedom which is supposed to consist in choosing to determine itself as either positive A or negative A would never escape from necessity. When freedom determines itself as positive A, it has not annihilated negative A. Rather, negative A subsists quite necessarily as something external for it. And the same is true vice versa if it determines itself as negative A. Freedom is freedom only if it, positively or negatively, unites negative A and positive A, and so ceases to determine itself as positive A. In the union of these two specific positions, both are annihilated. Positive A minus A equals 0. If this not is understood purely relatively to positive A and negative A, and the indifferent A itself is understood as something specific, a plus or a minus in contrast with another plus or minus, absolute freedom is beyond this opposition, just as it is above any opposition in any externality, and is simply insusceptible of any coercion, and coercion has no reality whatever. But this idea of freedom seems to itself be an abstraction, and if, for example, we were talking of concrete freedom, that of the individual, then this would establish that existence of a specific object and thereby establish purely empirical freedom as a possibility of choice, and thus also empirical necessity in the possibility of coercion, or in general the opposition of universality and singularity. For the individual is singularity, and freedom is the annihilation of singularity. In virtue of singularity, the individual is directly under specific limitations. Thus, something external is there for him, and coercion is therefore possible. Just allow me to say that at least this bit about the individual freedom is annihilation of singularity. Later, Hegel will not put this in this kind of framing because it gives a too one-sided interpretation of what is meant. Because here it seems Hegel is making no distinction between singularity and particularity, whereas singularity or individuality in the later system is the concrete universal, where to be an individual is indeed not to have these external impositions upon oneself, and it's still against coercion. But one still is specifically limited, except these limitations are self-given. And because they are self-given, one is perfectly universal and infinite. So the difference here is that the singularity he's talking about here is a particular singularity in which it is in finite opposition to other things, and that's what determines it. But it is one thing to put specific limitations on the individual under the form of infinity, and another to put them on him absolutely. Specific limitation under the form of infinity is also cancelled thereby, and the individual is only as a free being. That is, since specific determinations are posited in him, he is the absolute indifference of these determinations. And in this, his ethical nature formally consists. So too, individuals generally being different, whether from themselves or from something other, and having a bearing on something external, this externality itself is indifferent and a living relation, that is, organization. And herein, since totality occurs only in an organization, consists the positive element in ethical life. I'll reread that, all right. But it is one thing to put specific limitation on the individual under the form of infinity, and another to put them on him absolutely. Specific limitation is under the form of infinity. Specific limitation under the form of infinity is also cancelled thereby, and the individual is only as a free being. That is, since specific determinations are posited in him, he is the absolute indifference of these determinations. There you go. That's exactly what the individual is. So it's not that the individual is placed into a determinate relationship to something else, but the individual is the determinate relationship within themselves. And then obviously this is the form of the concrete universal, and ethical nature or ethical life will share this exact same structure and dynamic. So two individuals generally being different, whether from themselves or from something other, and having a bearing on something external, this externality itself is indifferent and a living relation, that is, organization. And herein, since totality occurs only in an organization, consists the positive element of ethical life. So obviously, individuals are generally different, whether from themselves or something other, and have relations or bearings on something external. But this externality itself is indifferent. And the indifference here is what Hegel later just calls negative unity. It's an indifferent difference, or the identity of difference, or the difference of identity, whichever way you want to put it. The particular universality, or the individual universality, or the individual universal, either way. The unity, that externality which divides the individual themselves, is not in opposition to the individual as such. The universal does not formally subsume individuals and unite them from outside. It is both their mode of distinction and their mode of self-subsistence. Just like an organism is. You're a living thing that is made of other living things. And insofar as your life proceeds, their life proceeds also. And their life, though in aggregate, leads to your life as a whole. Your life as a whole also leads to their life as an aggregate. And that's the relationship of organization. And organization here is meant quite literally organ, individualization, organism, and so ethical life has the form of organism to this extent. But the indifference of the single individual is a negative one in relation to the being of these specific determinations. But when his being is posited as individuality, that is, as a negation positively inseparable for his being, as a specific determination whereby the external as such is held fast, then what remains to him is only purely negative absoluteness or infinity, the absolute negation of both positive A and negative A, or the absolute adoption of this individual being into the concept, since negative A is something external to the subject's determination, positive A. This relation replaces the subject under an alien power, but since he can with equal facility posit his positive A negatively as a determination and can cancel and alienate it, he remains perfectly free in the face of the possibility or the actuality of an alien power. By negating positive A as well as negative A, he is subdued but not coerced. He would have to suffer coercion only if positive A were absolutely fixed in him, which would allow an endless chain of other determinations to be attached to the man who is himself a determination. The possibility of abstracting from determinations is without restriction. In other words, there is no determination which is absolute, for this would be a direct self-contradiction. But freedom itself, or infinity, is indeed the negative and yet the absolute, and the subject's individual being is absolute singularity taken up into the concept, is negatively absolute infinity, pure freedom. This negatively absolute, pure freedom appears as death, and by his ability to die, the subject proves himself free and entirely above all coercion. Death is the absolute subjugator, because the subjection is absolute, or because in it individuality becomes pure individuality and not the positing of positive A with the exclusion of negative A, an exclusion which would be no true negation, but only the positive of negative A as something external and of positive A simultaneously as a determination. But the cancellation of the plus and minus alike, the individuality is therefore its own concept, and so infinite. And the opposite of itself, or absolute liberation, and the pure individuality, which is in death, is its own opposite, universality. Thus there is freedom in subjection, because subjection bears purely on the cancellation of a determination, not simply one side of the determination, but the determination posited positively as well as negatively, subjectively as well as objectively, and so considered in itself. Freedom keeps itself purely negative. Or, since the cancelling can itself be grasped and expressed positively by reflection, the cancellation of both sides of the determination appears accordingly as the complete equal positing of the determined on both its sides. Boy, a paragraph that's longer than a page. Oh, Germans. Alright, let me read this entire paragraph because that was pretty dense. But the indifference of the single individual is a negative one in relation to the being of the specific determinations. Okay, the individual is distinct from their determinations in this relation, but when his being is posited as individuality, that is, as a negation positively inseparable for his being, as a specific determination whereby the external as such is held fast, then what remains to him is only purely negative absoluteness, or infinity. Okay, but when his being is posited as individuality, that is, as negation positively inseparable for his being, as a specific determination whereby the external as such is held fast, then what remains to him is only purely negative absoluteness, or infinity, the absolute negation of both plus A and negative A, or the absolute adoption of his individual being into the concept. Okay, so insofar as the individual is in a negative relationship, the only negative relationship that really makes sense is an infinitely negative relationship to these choices or properties or determinations themselves, positive A or negative A. that if the individual must be determinate, then its determination is not either the plus A or the negative A, but is that which stands opposed and against the positive A and negative A as their pure ideality. And he says the individual is taken up into the concept. To the absolute negation of both plus A and negative A, or the absolute adoption of this individual being into the concept. Since negative A is something external to the subject's determination, positive A, this relation places the subject under an alien power. But since he can with equal facility positive A negatively as a determination and can cancel and alienate it, he remains perfectly free in the face of the possibility or the actuality of an alien power. Alright, since the choice of the choice itself remains open, and the subject here is not locked into just positive A forever, or just negative A forever, then they're still free from coercion. They can still self-determine. By negating positive A as well as negative A, he is subdued but not coerced. He would have to suffer coercion only if positive A were absolutely fixed in him, which would allow an endless chain of other determinations to be attached to the man who is himself a determination. The possibility of abstraction from determinations is without restriction. In other words, there is no determination which is absolute, for this would be a direct self-contradiction. The way in which determination being absolute would be a self-contradiction, because then determination would itself be determinate. But then it wouldn't be absolute. It would be determined by something else that determines it as determination or determinateness. I don't know if that makes sense. Might be too much Hegelese. DM, does that make sense to you? Josh?
Yeah.
Alright. But freedom itself, or infinity, is indeed the negative and yet the absolute, and the subject's individual being is absolute singularity taken up into the concept, is negatively absolute infinity, pure freedom. This negatively absolute, pure freedom appears as death. And by his ability to die, the subject proves himself free and entirely above all coercion. So the reason how should I put it? Okay, but freedom itself is indeed a negative and yet the absolute, and the subject's individual being is absolute singularity taken up into the concept, is negatively absolute infinity, and this is the key reason why this links to death. This negatively absolute, pure freedom appears as death. Why is death the absolute linked here? Because what could be more absolutely negative than death? You know, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, he takes this exact argument and he rephrases it, and he says, death is the absolute master for the slave. It shakes him to the core, or them to the core. And in the fear of death, the mind's rigidity falls, like, also breaks away. And therefore, the falling away of determinations, which death represents, in thought, is the falling away of, like, in that intuition of the feeling of fear of death, of absolute fear. Conceptually speaking, in a thought itself, manifests as the pure falling away of the rigidity of the categories. All the categories that are finite die, quote unquote. And by his ability to die, the subject proves himself free and entirely above all coercion. This also goes with the whole example of the slave, that insofar as, so long as you are not willing to be dominated, and you're willing to die rather than be subjected, then you cannot be coerced. It's simple as that. Death is the absolute subjugator, because the subjection is absolute, or because in it individuality becomes pure individuality and not the positing of positive A with the exclusion of negative A. Because with death, all predicates or qualities or determinations fall away, vanish. An exclusion which would be no true negation, but only the positing of negative A as something external and of positive A simultaneously as a determination. But the cancellation of the plus and minus alike, the individuality, is therefore its own concept and so infinite. So because the subjection is absolute, and here, shifts to the subject itself is death here. It's not that the subject dies, but rather the subject becomes the death itself, the death of positive A and negative A. Not by excluding them, which would then put it into a determinate relationship where they determine it, or where they determine positive A and negative A would determine the subject, even if the subject took them on alternatively, positive A and then negative A. In each case, he would be determined by the other, or they would be determined by the other. But the subject is the cancellation of the plus and minus alike. The individuality is therefore its own concept and so infinite. It's its own concept because it's the universal in which they inhere. They are finite, and the subject is the infinite, which orders them or organizes them. And the opposite of itself, or absolute liberation, and the pure individuality, which is in death, is its own opposite, universality. So, death, the absolute subjugation here becomes also the absolute liberation. Thus, there is freedom in subjection, because subjection bears purely on the cancellation of a determination, not simply one side of the determination, but the determination posited positively as well as negatively, subjectively as well as objectively, and so considered in itself, freedom keeps itself purely negative. So freedom, or the real universal, the true universal, or the idea itself never falls into the finite opposition. It is always above the dichotomy, because it is what constitutes the dichotomy itself. Or, since the cancelling can itself be grasped and expressed positively by reflection, the cancellation of both sides, the determination, appears accordingly as the completely equal positing of the determined on both its sides. So completely equal positing in that, the positive posits the negative posits the positive. They posit each other, and that mutual positing also happens to be the positing of the subject, the infinity, which posits their own positing. Applied to punishment, for example, this means that retribution alone is rational in it. For by retribution, the crime is subjugated. A state of affairs, positive A, brought about by the crime is complemented by the bringing about of negative A, and so both are annihilated. Or, looked at positively, the state of affairs, positive A, there is linked to, for the criminal, the opposite state, negative A, and both are brought about equally, while the crime had brought about only one. Thus, the punishment is the restoration of freedom, and the criminal has remained, or rather been made free, just as the punisher has acted rationally and freely. In this, its specific character, punishment is thus something in itself truly infinite and absolute, revered and feared on its own account. It issues from freedom, and even as subjugated remains in freedom. If, on the other hand, punishment is understood as coercion, it is posited merely as a specific determination, as something purely finite, carrying no rationality in itself. It falls wholly under the common concept of one specific thing contrasted with another, or as an item with which something else, the crime, can be purchased. The state, as judicial power, trades in specific wares, called crimes, for sale in exchange for other specific wares, punishments, and the legal code is its price list. Okay, so for those of you who don't like retribution theories of justice, sucks to be you. But jokes aside, later Hegel is not this abstract about it. The general argument seems to have remained essentially the same up until the philosophy of right, as far as I'm aware. But there's other things he brings up about the nature of justice, which are more than just retribution. And then this argument appears multiple times everywhere. This appears in the Phenomenology, chapter 3. Pretty sure it does actually appear in the Science of Logic. It also appears, obviously, in the Philosophy of Right. It appears in a few places in some other of the lectures series. So applied to punishment, this means that retribution alone is rational in it, for by retribution the crime is subjugated. So, if somebody commits a crime against you and you don't retribute, you have allowed an external determination to remain external. You have not subjugated it or sublated it. A state of affairs, positive A, brought about by the crime, is complemented by the bringing about of negative A, and so both are annihilated. Alright, a state of affairs, positive A, brought about by the crime, is complemented by the bringing about of negative A, and so both are annihilated. So I assume positive A is the crime, negative A is the punishment. Or looked at positively with a state of affairs, positive A, there is linked for the criminal the opposite state, negative A, and both are brought about equally, while the crime had brought about only one. So the crime brings about the positive A. The state of affairs, positive A, there is linked for the criminal the opposite state, negative A. Thus the punishment is the restoration of freedom, and the criminal has remained, or rather been made free, just as the punisher has acted rationally and freely. Oh god, this is... So as I'm understanding this here, the criminal commits the crime, brings about the state of affairs, positive A. I would have used negative A for that, but okay, whatever. If this remains this way, there is still this tension of the negative A in relationship to that positive A, which is unresolved, and therefore the criminal is actually unfree, is coerced. Even if even if the negative A is only a possibility, this possibility is still a determinacy external to them, and therefore places them in a state of being coerced by this very possibility of the coming of retribution, whether it does or does not come. The punishment is the restoration of freedom, and the criminal has remained, or rather has been made free, just as the punisher has acted rationally and free. The only way I can make concrete sense of this is take, for example, somebody commits a crime, or you commit a crime, I commit a crime. Let's put me in an example. I commit a crime, and suppose nobody catches me. Nonetheless, I'm still determined by that because I am an absolute coward, and I am not good at lying. And so the fear of just being caught, even if in the act later you don't get caught, that fear still leaves me determined. And I don't walk around like a free person. You get paranoid. I mean, I stole a candy bar once when I was like 7. It scared the shit out of me. Never did it again. one could say it's traumatizing. It's like just the sheer fear or the possibility of punishment, whether there is or is not. There's a sense in which, like, if you actually finally get caught and you're punished, that fear itself just finally goes away. That tension in your life is like, okay, at least this thing's finally done and gotten out of the way with. I've done the thing. The consequence came back to me. It's been canceled out. Now I can move on. Now I don't have that hanging outside me or over me. I've resolved. It's been resolved. Thus, the punishment is the restoration of freedom, and the criminal has remained, or rather being made free, just as the punisher has acted rationally and freely. And those who punish, I assume, would be the ones who are on the negative side of things, in which they're determined by the actuality or possibility of crime. And so, until they punish someone, they're also left in a state of coercion as well, because there are these crimes going on that have gone unresolved, and so they're determinate states of affair external to us. Was anybody going to say anything? I think I heard something. I suppose not. What do you think about that, Josh? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it makes sense. Definitely agree with it. I know we've spoken about it before.
All right. In this specific character, punishment is thus something in itself truly infinite and absolute, revered and feared on its own account. It issues from freedom, and even as subjugated remains in freedom. If, on the other hand, punishment is understood as coercion, it is posited merely as a specific determination and as something purely finite, carrying no rationality in it. It falls wholly under the common concept of one specific thing contrasted with another, or as an item which something else, the crime, can be purchased. As an item with which something else, the crime can be purchased. The state as judicial power trades in specific wares, called crimes, for sale in exchange for other specific wares, and the legal code is its price list. That is a peculiar example. I bet Marx would have loved this had he read it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I do think, like, that is a real problem, though, when it's understood only just as, like, some arbitrary coercion. And I think it's a problem, too, like, not even just for those committing crimes, but even, like, if people are saying, I'm not going to commit crimes because I'll get punished for it. And so they'll do other horrible things which aren't crimes because their only concern is for, like, okay, what'll get me in trouble, what won't get me in trouble? What's legal, what's not legal, not what's right, what's wrong. And when people operate on that basis, they're not being good citizens, even if they're following the law.
Yeah, there's still the element. There's the element of coercion of which, they feel restricted by the laws. They don't see the laws as rational and constitutive of their own reality, meaning the reality of the subject within the state. Okay, so where are we? Okay, so apparently here is a transition to discussions of ethical life. So this is a good place to leave it here. This was an interesting one. So for those of you listening, hopefully you find this interesting. See you around.